Undisputed Street Fighter was published in 2017 as a celebration of the franchise's 30th anniversary. Half the book is what I'll call, for the sake of simplicity, franchise history, while the second half is a character showcase. We'll start with the first half first, and despite what I just said, you really don't want to think of this as history. There is a lot of history in here, of course, but it's too brief, scattered, and not serious enough to think of it in that way. Instead, think of it as a celebration of the Street Fighter franchise. This book feels more like a fan magazine on steroids in that rather than presenting a robust, organized, continuous narrative history, it's structured more like where each spread or two is a short article on a particular subject of Street Fighter miscellany. The obvious handicap of this approach is that there is absolutely no depth to anything, which can make it really hard for the book to feel satisfying or meaningful in any way. However, theoretically this approach could still work really well if it mitigates that handicap by, firstly, making up in breadth what it lacks in depth, presenting a wide variety of subjects, which the book is okay at. I really enjoyed how it's not just on the games, but covers the franchise as a whole. So there's stuff on the movies, cartoons, comics, action figures, and even though none of it has any rewarding depth, for a book trying to celebrate the franchise as a whole, it's still really cool and adds a lot of great stuff to look at. The problem is that although it's okay in its breadth, it's still not great. Still not nearly in any way comprehensive or useful in its coverage. Like, if your book's not going to have any comprehensive depth, then I at least expect comprehensive breadth so that, even if it is shallow, everything at least gets a mention, if only presented in a list or something. But it doesn't do depth at all and is only kind of okay at breadth, so it doesn't really achieve either goal. And yet the author thinks it's okay to forego both in favor of dedicating so much space and having a huge emphasis on fans and fan works, and particularly obsessed with the professional tournament esports aspect of the community. We'll go into that a little more later. So the book's not rewarding or insightful enough in its depth, nor useful or thorough enough in its breadth to be a particularly good reference book. And a book doesn't necessarily have to do either of those things in order to be successful. It can dispense with depth and breadth and still be perfectly fine, as long as the book makes sure that its chosen subjects and the short word count dedicated to each one are hard-hitting, important, and interesting. And that is just something this book is embarrassingly bad at. And so it just ends up feeling like, what is this book? It doesn't do anything well enough. It's not fulfilling in any way. Now, before I get into trashing the book further, I want to be very clear that I'm only referring to the text. The visuals and layout are brilliant, and I'll give that due credit later. But for now, I'm just talking about the text, because as we're going through, you're going to see how good the book looks and how well presented it is, but don't let that fool you because it's masking some rancid and absolutely hopeless text. I hate how often media tie-in books are given to journalists who may be fine at writing for periodicals or the web, but don't seem to understand the difference between writing for those and writing a book. They treat them as if they're the same, which is completely inappropriate. It's like going to a restaurant and being served bubblegum for dinner. And so what we get is, like I mentioned, something that feels like a magazine scaled up to book size, and that's very true throughout. Even things like the frequent use of pull quotes, which is a journalism technique and completely unnecessary in a book, it's just a waste of space. But worse is the author writes like a journalist in the worst possible way. Like he's writing light, casual, fluffy magazine articles and feels the need to subject the reader to his punchy narrative prose instead of treating it as a serious book chronicling anything of actual worth. And so, in terms of text content, like a magazine, it feels like a disposable novelty, yet it's 5 times the price of a magazine because how it's presented, so it's bubblegum dressed as lamb. The author mentions having interviewed 80 people for the book. Many of them are just fans though, but even the quotes are frequently pointless and poorly chosen, with a huge emphasis on sound bites rather than substance. And it's this lack of substance that runs rampant through the text and is the book's biggest failing. It's not just that every section, chapter, article, whatever you want to call them, it's not just that they're too short. The bigger problem is that they're lacking substance, interest, worth. Most of the word count is so insipid and frivolous. Now, don't get me wrong, of course there's a lot to learn in this book, lots of cool information you won't find anywhere else. I'm just saying that it's severely lacking proportional to the size of the book and the word count and has been completely and deplorably mishandled. So for example, there's a spread on the Capcom vs SNK games. The text is just half a page and says nothing beyond the two rival companies agreed to produce games using the other's characters. The only thing that could even be chalked up to an interesting fact is that it says both companies each produced 2 games based on the deal, yet even then it doesn't even name 3 of the 4 games, and certainly doesn't tell you anything about them, their creation, trivia, behind the scenes, literally nothing. Just half a page of wasted words devoid of any value, information, or purpose. But then compare that to the very next page, which is a spread on the history of the Hadouken, also only half a page of text, but really good, a well-chosen topic and primarily made up of interesting info about the creation of the move. Even though still very short and no depth, it's not about needing more because it does the job and has a reason to be here, though most spreads or subjects aren't so clean-cut and are usually a mixture of successful and failing text. But honestly, I can't even call this book a mixed bag because the failures make up the vast majority, so there is good text, but overall it is disgracefully outweighed by the terrible text. You need to understand just how broad and thin the text is. The book is severely lacking detail, with a massive problem being the huge reliance throughout on presenting general blanket comments instead of specific information, which renders a lot of the text pointless and superficial. Additionally, both the tone and content of the word count is more interested in celebrating success and trying to impress rather than just simply presenting actual information. It's a lot of the author pontificating about the importance of Street Fighter or the success of certain aspects. Too much editorializing, like he's trying to convince you that Street Fighter is awesome and innovative, as if the book's audience needs that, rather than just reporting actual facts or interesting information. So for example, stuff like this. Blah blah blah, not only helped to make Street Fighter a transcendent brand, but his images are fixed in the collective consciousness of a generation of gamers. That may be true, but this book is overflowing with those sort of ostentatious, aggrandizing statements that are unnecessary and offer nothing, just making it sound like a puff piece. So you have the double problem of the author's tiresome tone and style combined with a lack of substance, meaning it's hundreds of pages of him saying nothing annoyingly. The author just seems to have no understanding or appreciation of what makes for interesting, worthy reading. Like, it wastes so much space with that sort of stuff when there is so much important stuff not included or barely touched on. For example, there's a fantastic article about the development of Street Fighter 1's arcade cabinets, but that's all there is on the first game. Nothing about its creation, inspiration, development, doesn't even really talk about the characters or anything to do with number 1. Even Street Fighter 2, which gets the lion's share of the book's focus, still has a serious lack of specificity and detail. For example, there is a spread on creating the characters for number 2, but not a single thing of interest or value is said. Both the writer himself and the quotes from interviews are just so general, obvious, and shallow. No interesting details are in sight. Nothing. Absolutely insipid discussion of the broad ideas of creating the characters overall, which is how most things in this book are discussed. And so just to be very clear, I'm not saying this book is bad because it lacks depth or needs more words or anything. 30 years of a franchise like this is enormous, and I don't expect a book to be able to cover everything, and certainly not in minute detail. That's not the issue. The issue is that what is here is too frequently foolishly bad, weak, and really lacking. Like I said at the start, the idea of this book being made up of a variety of short, scattered, independently focused articles, I think that does have the potential to be really cool, and you can make up for that by ensuring each section is well chosen, well used, hard hitting, and packed with good information. And that's where the book has failed. Too many uninteresting or at least unworthy topics, and then even the good topics are wasted on frivolous text. Even from the perspective that this is more a collection of independent articles, the book still lacks organization and flow. For example, it sort of follows the history of talking about SF2 and then 3, but then breaks off to discuss the movies and comics for 20 pages before returning to talk about the history of 4. Rather than being clearly organized by subject or chronologically, it appears to be trying to do both simultaneously to a very disjointed and jarring effect. So the organization just feels random. Even once you get into the character half of the book, for some reason, or lack thereof, the profiles are occasionally interspersed with more random articles that feel like they should have been in the first half. Speaking of the disorganized character section, even more unfathomable is that the characters are not organized in any discernible way. They're not listed alphabetically or by date. The only way you can find a specific character's pages is through the index. I feel positive positive I must be missing something here and they're just organized in a way too esoteric for me to comprehend, because otherwise it's insane that they could make an unintuitive mess over something as simple as organizing the characters in a way that displays any sort of intelligence. I mean, if they can't even get something that simple right, it's no wonder the rest of the book is so mishandled. The utter lack of any effort put into structuring and presenting information in the book is absolutely pathetic, and when combined with the lack of substantial information, it's just not even a good reference book. It doesn't feel like a solid, useful, or convenient go-to resource on anything. Like there's not even a chart or timeline of the game releases, or like here's a list of all the Street Fighter games and editions. Nothing. In fact, it can even be hard just to find one of the main games. It should have had a better division of sections dedicated to each game, with screenshots, poster art to give each entry a clearer identity and make it easier to find, and provide better understanding of the history and development of each game and the evolution of the series. Even Street Fighter Eternal Challenge, which was the first book to sort of present a history of the franchise, even that did a much better job of giving each game its own clear section and discussion. Whereas here, even though it's still a vaguely chronological history, it's all just sort of jumbled in together, feeling very haphazard and thoughtlessly done. So like I said at the start, it's not organized, consistent, serious, or comprehensive enough to be useful either as a reference book or history book. Nor is it well written or interesting enough for most of the individual articles to be enjoyable just in their own right. The text as a whole just feels low effort, and that the author clearly didn't put a lot of thought into what they were doing, or is just simply too oblivious as to what the book should be, what would make worthy text a worthy book that people would actually find value in reading. Another example of the author's terrible judgment is the ridiculously heavy focus on fans and esports. Now, before getting stuck into it, I just want to be very clear that I am not criticizing the fan works themselves. In fact, probably my favorite SF book is Street Fighter Tribute, which is a fan art book and I absolutely love it, but that's because it's its own thing. Likewise, I completely acknowledge what an important part of Street Fighter's history and success tournament play has been. To hear about that stuff in a YouTube video, blog, or even in its own book would be another story. My issue is that it's inappropriate to include so much of that stuff in the context of a book like this, to have it take up space in an official book when so much official stuff is not even mentioned, and what is so disappointingly starved for quality or even acceptable information. For an author to think that so much space taken up by fans talking about their personal stories and experiences and photos of them as if anyone besides them actually cares, to think that that's worth paying money for and preserving, and that's why anyone would buy this book, it's absolutely insulting and ridiculous. I bought this book with the expectation of reading about either 1, the art and making of, which this book's text does very, very little of, or at least 2, a reference book with interesting information about things more closely and officially related to and created for the games and franchise itself. I came here for Street Fighter itself, not its fans. It's a waste of so much space for something that less than a handful of people reading this book will care about, done at the expense of more important, interesting, relevant content. For example, there is only one spread on Street Fighter V, containing nothing about its development or creation beyond generalized comments that just sound like a pre-release promo interview from a gaming magazine to talk up 2 or 3 of its features. Yet the book also dedicates the same amount of space to cosplay, which, by the way, only features one person. Think about that. This book gives the entirety of its discussion of Street Fighter V the same amount of space it does to a single cosplayer. Other things like giving a whole page talking about the 2 guys who have collected some of the original Street Fighter 2 art, and we have to read about their stories. And that's even when the imagery in the book becomes less amazing, when you see these pictures of these fans as if anyone cares or their stories and photos are worth paying money for and taking up space in a book like this. I'm painfully aware that it probably sounds like I'm being an asshole to these fans, so I just hope you understand where I'm coming from. It's not a personal attack against them or anything, it's their inappropriate inclusion in the context of this book that I'm criticizing. Inappropriate because 1, like I mentioned before, it's taking up a lot of space on things that most readers won't be interested in, and done at the expense of being able to include much needed better content, and 2, it undermines the legitimacy of the book. Both in terms of the content and style of the text, it feels like amateur fanzine miscellany that's hard to take seriously rather than an official professional product. To include so much focus on fans and esports and their experience and stories seems like, at best, misguided ignorance, and at worst, lazy filler. However, that is all just in terms of the text. The images and layout are another matter entirely, with both of them being absolutely outstanding. As an eye-candy visual celebration of Street Fighter, it's really wonderful. Not only because of the quality, curation, and variety of the images, but just as important is the amazing layout, which I can't applaud highly enough because of how it has allowed for such a huge number of images to be packed in here, but also having them be perfectly sized and making the most of the large format pages. Though I probably shouldn't say perfect, because the only exception to this praise is that some of the posters and artworks have been stupidly cropped, so don't get the full piece. But besides that, the imagery and its use are easily the best, strongest things about this book. Again, this is another area where on the one hand, the variety of visuals is really good because it's constantly exciting to turn the page and you get to see a bit of everything. But it also suffers from the same problem as the text when, one, it takes that variety too far, and like I said before, space is being wasted on photos of fans and such, and two, there's so much stuff to cover in relatively so little space that it's not a very good go-to reference on anything. So for example, one of my favorite surprise inclusions was several pages on the different action figure lines. I love that this was included in terms of representing the franchise as a whole and looks great in terms of adding visual variety to the book. However, they obviously can only include a select few, so it's not like it presents a resource of every figure produced or anything. So you have this push and pull thing where it's awesome and exciting being able to see a little bit of everything under one cover, but in doing so it means that it doesn't cover anything thoroughly. It does a far better job of this than the text by making the most of what little space it has for each subject and using it to wonderful effect, and that's super commendable, but the reality is that it can sort of be overshadowed and undermined once you start accounting for other books that have a more specific and thorough focus. So like the artworks, which look amazing and are a big draw for this book, until you realize that only very little of the art in here hasn't already been included in the dedicated art books, so it may look awesome in here, but if you already have those dedicated art books, are you just doubling up on stuff you already have? Or if you don't have any of those books and the art is really what you're drawn to, especially since most of the text is unimpressive, would you be better off just getting one or several of the art books, since they have all or most of the art that's in this book, plus more, and without any waste on text or images you're not interested in. However, in terms of art that possibly you won't find in other books, this is the only Street Fighter book I could identify that includes Mick McGinty's amazing, iconic pieces done for the US marketing of Street Fighter 2. Take that claim with a grain of salt, because I'm not 100% sure. In fact, I find it incredulous that no other book contains his works, but I can't recall any that do except as small box art in the Eternal Challenge book, and they're definitely and bizarrely not included in the Art of Street Fighter book. So they're a really great inclusion here, especially because I think it's everything he did for Street Fighter, even though that only constitutes a handful of works. But again, I'm not knowledgeable enough to say with complete certainty that any of this is fact, so please feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm mistaken. But even beyond the art, there is more imagery in here that I really liked, again because of the visual variety and testament to the franchise as a whole. For example, even just something like screenshots from the games, they look great and are a part of chronicling the visual evolution of the actual games, and that's not something you're going to see in an art book. But I think it's worth keeping in mind as we're going through, yes, the images look really nice, but you want to ask yourself, beyond the art, most of which already has its own books, are there enough other images depicting stuff you're interested in enough to make it worth buying the book? This excellent handling and abundance of the images is emphasized and given full force in the second half of the book, which in addition to its minimizing of the text, unsurprisingly makes it the best part of the book and thankfully the biggest part too. Pretty much every Street Fighter book has pages dedicated to each character, but this book is by far the best in my opinion, both in terms of representing one of the most complete rosters under one cover, rivaled only by the World Warrior Character Encyclopedia, but visually this is far superior to the Character Encyclopedia because of the sheer number and variety of images shown for each character. Featuring art and screenshots from the different games is fun to look at and gives a sense of the character's evolution over time, and it's made sure to pack as many images per page per character, done in a way that is both appropriate and fulfilling. So it's brilliant, and that this is what makes up the majority of the pages goes a long way to at least attempting to salvage the book. Though I mean, you know, all it is really just a character showcase gallery, so I don't expect everyone to find this as impressive and enjoyable, but as a visual history and gallery of the characters, I still think it's so cool and very well done. Even if the text was in Japanese, I would still just love looking at each of the character collages, and overall I find this book to be the best visual tribute to Street Fighter. You'll make your own assessment of the visuals as we're looking through, but just to give you an indication of the text in this half, the way it works, each character character gets between a 1 and 6 page profile, sort of proportional to how many appearances they've had. First of all, like the rest of this book, it's all non-fiction, so you don't want to think about this book as being a source for lore, since that stuff's only in here when mentioned indirectly, which is actually a really good thing, as it doesn't put this book in a competition it can't win with the World Warrior character encyclopedia. Instead, for each character you get a very short, inconsistent write-up containing a mix of any of the following elements. Primarily a description of kinda who the character is, how they look and or their history in the series, again not in terms of their bio or anything, just more like their non-fiction history, like first appearance and that sort of thing. And then less frequently some sort of behind the scenes information about the character, sometimes it's a quote from someone at Capcom, or maybe just some gameplay strategy of the character, and then each fighter also has some signature moves highlighted. The text is still pretty awful overall, but I'd say the ratio of presenting good information actually rises to about 40% of the text in the character section. And listen, that is a very generous estimation. When I say 40%, I'm not just talking about like the text that's really good and worth recording in a book like this. When I say 40% of the information is good, I've really opened that up to include anything that isn't just an objective waste of ink. So in terms of that acceptable 40%, mostly that's just, like I said, about the history of the character's inclusion in the games, which I think does count as good information that should definitely be in the book. It's just that that represents the bulk of the worthy information in the character section, so it's not exactly an impressive offering or research from a writer who had access to Capcom and the creators. Like the majority of the text in this book, even when it is acceptable, it's still so weak and unambitious. Occasionally there are some really great facts, information, and anecdotes presented. For some characters their whole profile is great, for others you get maybe a good sentence or two, but then you also get character profiles that are complete duds with absolutely nothing interesting. Not only being boring and wasteful, but also painfully annoying in this section where the author switches from the affected, pretentious narrative prose he uses in the first half, which was bad enough, but then in the character section he becomes even more casual but awkwardly, and even worse, absolutely obnoxious in his constant lame attempts to be funny or clever in his descriptions and observations. I just don't understand how he was writing this like, yeah, forget research and presentation of actual Street Fighter information, the real reason fans are gonna pay for this book and treasure it for years to come is for my super hip and droll takes on the characters. In order to restrict his opportunity for filling the pages with his insufferable wit, I think like the fact file type approach would have been better and made the quality and content of the text for each character more consistent. It should have focused solely on the best parts it does occasionally display, i.e. the individual character trivia, history, behind the scenes, creation, design, info, quotes, and anecdotes from the creators, providing they're better chosen for their substance and not just how good it looks as a pull quote. Because at the moment, and this is very true for the writing in the entire book, you have, maybe 30 to 40% of the text being acceptable, appropriate information, but then, rather like how many journalists write articles, the author is then primarily, or for some characters exclusively, presenting his own superficial observations and descriptions and trying to use what I imagine he considers humor and narrative prose to pad it out and meet the required word count, rather than putting effort into doing research and relying solely on presenting actual information. And again, I can't understand how it's seen as permissible for a writer working on an official book with access to the creators and 30 years of material to have him fabricating the majority of the word count by just pulling paragraphs out of his arse based on his own conjectures and notions instead of just relying on facts and quotes or anything actually worth presenting. It is truly shocking how poorly handled the text in this book is on every level. The style, tone, focus, organization, and most of all, content. And it's just so disappointing that a book on a franchise that deserves much better is spoiled through being written by an indefensibly terrible, bungling hack of a journalist who's clearly out of his depth and has no idea what he's doing, wasting the opportunity by doing an embarrassingly bad and negligent job of it all round. And I mean, look, I don't want to undersell that there is a notable amount of good stuff that is worth being in here. It's just hard to appreciate that when more notable is that the garbage majority is overshadowing it, and because even when it does present good information, the text's short, shallow, and varied nature, combined with a lack of consistency, structure, and I guess even purpose, means that most of the interesting information doesn't have anything to really hang off or contribute to, and so it just feels like scattered, random Street Fighter trivia. And even then, even though it's certainly not devoid of anything worth reading, reading, just that it mostly is, say, 60 to 70%. And again, that's very lenient what I've chalked up to being acceptable, because once you start taking into consideration the advantages the book had available to its creation, then the overall impression is that it's very weak, unimpressive, and lacking both in quality and quantity, that's then been taken and just lazily spewed between two covers with zero effort or intelligence put into crafting, structuring, or presenting the information in a useful, convenient, or enjoyable way, all with the added insult of being written in a way that is frequently obnoxious and annoying. That a book written about Street Fighter could even be this boring and unpleasant beggars belief, but that there is an even worse Street Fighter book of this type in existence is depression-inducing knowledge I will scar you with in the next video. So yeah, really what we've got is something that visually looks like the ultimate Street Fighter book it should be. It's just so disappointing that it doesn't read like it. So as awesome as it is from a visual perspective, and admirable in how the image curation and layout is doing all the heavy lifting to give this book any worth and enjoyment, you do have to ask yourself, is that enough? Is this book worth it just in terms of the visuals and the relatively small scattering of genuinely worthwhile or exclusive information it contains? What is it this book's offering? What are you getting out of it? As long as you're asking and answering those questions so you can make a decision you'll be happy with, that's important for you to consider. But I will say, personally, the satisfaction I get from this book is enough. Just in terms of the visuals, it is my favorite Street Fighter book to look at, even compared to the dedicated art books, just because of the quantity and variety of the images. The book still has that fan appeal as a great piece to own in your collection, if only as a visual testament and celebration of the franchise. Obviously, it's absolutely unforgivable that it's not more than that, and I'm just so irate when, as a fan, as is so often the case, you just have to resign yourself to finding enough contentment in a consolation prize, because, you know, it is what it is, so it's either that or nothing. Or is it? Kind of. But there are a lot of other Street Fighter related books that might be a better investment of your time and money depending on what you're interested in. But I'll talk a little more about those at the end of the next video, which will be a review on the unfathomably even worse book I alluded to, Street Fighter: The Complete History.